Once upon a time there was a poor miller who had 3 sons. Being very ill, he called his sons to his bedside and said,
"My sons, I have little to leave you when I die. Only this mill, my donkey, and the cat. So let the eldest of you take the mill, the next one the donkey, and you, my youngest, the cat."
When the old man had died, and the 3 sons were left to fend for themselves, the 2 eldest were contented enough, for together they could make a living with the donkey turning the mill wheel to grind the corn. But the youngest son was not happy at all. "What can I do with a cat?" he said in despair. "I can't make a living with a cat. All I can do is make a hat out of his fur." Now the cat had been listening to the young man's words, and, stepping forward, he suddenly began to speak in a clear voice. "Master," he said, "do not kill me, I beg of you. I shall be far more useful to you alive than dead." "How can that be?" asked the young man, very surprised to find he possessed a cat who could talk. "If you will get me a sack and a pair of leather riding boots, you shall have no cause for complaint," answered the cat. Deciding that he might as well see what the cat could do for him, the young man spent the last of his money on a pair of riding boots, got a sack from the mill, and gave the cat what he had asked for. Drawing on the boots as if he had been used to such things all his life, and tying the sack round his neck, the cat strode off towards a meadow where he had often seen rabbits. There he filled the sack with lettuce leaves, and sat down and pretended to be asleep. After a few minutes, a nice fat rabbit, overcome with greed, popped its head into the sack to get at the lettuce leaves. In a flash, the cat had pulled the strings of the sack tight, and that was the end of the rabbit. With the rabbit in the sack, off went the cat to see the king. "Your Majesty," said Puss politely, bowing low, "my master, the Marquis of Carabas, sends you this fine rabbit with his compliments. He caught it himself on one of his estates." The king was delighted. "Tell your master," he said, "that the king is pleased to accept his present, and thanks him for his kindness." And Puss went home well pleased with his first day's work. Next day, Puss went hunting in a wheat field, and caught 2 partridges. These 2 he took to the king with the same message, that they were a present from his master, the Marquis of Carabas. For several months, Puss continued to bring game to the king, and each time the king sent his thanks to the Marquis of Carabas. Now, the Marquis of Carabas was a name that Puss had made up out of his head, but it quickly became a very well-known name at court. Everyone spoke of his huge estates and his skill as a huntsman. One day, when Puss was in the palace kitchen, he heard from the servants that the king was going to drive round his kingdom to see his subjects, and it was said His Majesty would be taking with him his only daughter, the most beautiful girl in all the land. Puss hurried home to the miller's son. "Master, master," he said, "now we shall make our fortunes." "How?" asked the miller's son in surprise. "I'm as poor as ever I was, and have no way of earning any money." "Just do as I tell you," said Puss, "and leave everything to me. First, you must pretend to be whoever I say you are. Next, you must go down to the river and have a swim." The miller's son couldn't understand how he was to make his fortune by having a swim in the river, but he did as the cat told him. Puss sat on the river bank waiting for the king's carriage. As soon as he saw it approaching, he hid his master's clothes under some bushes, and then, as the royal carriage came closer, he ran toward it, shouting, "Your Majesty! Your Majesty!" The king ordered the carriage to stop, and asked Puss what he wanted. "I wonder, sire," said Puss, "whether you could possibly help my master. He's bathing in the river, and unfortunately his clothes have been stolen." "That is easily remedied," said the king, and sent a servant to the palace to fetch a suit of clothes fit to be worn by the Marquis of Carabas. Elegantly dressed, the miller's son looked very fine indeed, for he was a good-looking fellow, and in good clothes looked better than ever. It was not surprising, therefore, that the princess eyed him with great interest. When she asked him to ride with her in the royal carriage, he was only too willing to oblige. In the meantime, Puss had been very busy. Having raced along the road ahead of the royal party, he'd stopped at a meadow where some men were haymaking. "Haymakers," he said to the men, "in a moment the king will be passing by in his carriage. If you will tell him this field belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, I will see that you are richly rewarded." As it happened, the king did stop near the meadow. "Good people," he said to the haymakers, "who owns this land?"
"The Marquis of Carabas, sire," came the answer.
"Well, Marquis," said the king, turning to the miller's son, "that's a fine crop of hay." The same thing happened again and again along the way. Whenever the king stopped and asked who was the owner of a field or a farm or an orchard, the answer was always, "The Marquis of Carabas, sire," because, of course, Puss was always one jump ahead. But now he came within sight of a great castle rising up out of a green forest. Puss knew that this castle belonged to an ogre, the owner of all the land round about, and decided to pay him a visit.
"Why, oh, my small friend,"
said the ogre,
"what can I do for you?"
"Sir," said Puss, with one of his most elegant bows, "I come from a land far away, but even there people speak of you and your wonderful knowledge of magic. They even say you can change your shape and turn yourself into any creature you like, a lion, for instance. Now, clever though I know you are, that surely couldn't be true. No one could do that."
"I can,"
said the ogre, and promptly turned himself into a roaring lion. Poor Puss was terrified and mighty relieved when the ogre resumed his normal shape. "Oh, marvellous," said Puss. "But then, of course, a lion is a big creature. It can't be so easy to turn into something small. A mouse, for instance."
"I tell you,"
shouted the ogre indignantly,
"that I can change into anything at all."
And to prove it, he turned himself into a tiny mouse, which was, of course, exactly what Puss wanted him to do. He pounced on the mouse and gobbled it up. At that moment, Puss heard the sound of wheels in the courtyard. It was the king's carriage, for the king had seen the turrets of the castle from a distance, and wished to visit it. "Welcome, your majesty," said Puss to the king, and to the princess, "Welcome, your highness." Then to both, "Welcome to my master's castle, Castle Carabas." "You've kept your secret well, Marquis," said the king as he got out of the carriage. "Such fields and harvests, such vast estates, and now such a magnificent castle." The miller's son made no answer. He was too bewildered to speak, but he smiled shyly at the princess. Puss led the way into the castle, and the king had to admit that he had never dreamed of such splendor. "You have only to say the word, my boy," said his majesty to the miller's son, "and my daughter shall be your wife. That is, of course, providing she wishes it too. Yes, said the princess, and yes, said the miller's son, and the king joined their hands together. Soon afterwards they were married, and were as happy as the day is long for the rest of their lives. As for Puss in Boots, he became a very great lord, and when the miller's son and the princess became king and queen, he stayed on in the ogre's castle by himself, and there he lived happily to a ripe old age, respected by everyone. But in spite of his age and dignity, now and then he would remember his youth, and he'd put on his boots and take his sack and go out and catch a rabbit or two, or even a mouse, just for the sake of old times.